Scholars have long been interested in the question of why and how nation states became the global gold standard of political organization during the last 2 centuries. Now, when I write of nationalism in the book, I do not have in mind ethnic hatred towards outsiders only, but rather I think of an old definition of nationalism by the British Czech scholar Ernest Gellner, who said that nationalism is primarily a principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent. So basically the idea that every people should have its own state. Now, I'm particularly interested in how this notion of nationalism spread in what after World War II became known as the Third World. And by way of example, I look at interwar Paris, because this was a place where so many of the political and intellectual elites that rose to prominence in Asia and Africa, but also in Latin America, after World War II had spent formative stints with a lasting impact on their lives. So, on the one hand, Paris had long been an important center of intellectual life in general, and this made it attractive, for example, for Latin American and Chinese students to whom I devote one of the chapters of the book. And they developed a clearer anti-imperialist consciousness, but also acquired political organizational skills as representatives of their community in interwar Paris. One very well-known example of this is Zhou Enlai. And on the other hand, growing numbers of colonial labor migrants went to Paris between the two wars. North Africans were the largest group of them in terms of numbers. There were roughly 70,000 in the Paris region by 1930. But there were also smaller groups of sub-Saharan Africans, from West Africa in particular, Malagasi's and Vietnamese workers. The most famous example here would be Ho Chi Minh, or the later Ho Chi Minh. And I argue that the coming together of those groups in such a small place, which was Paris, rendered global rights differentials, or basically the injustices of the imperial world order, much more palpable for them. And this setting politicized ethnicity and encouraged migrants to set up institutions that represented the everyday grievances of their respective communities. And these institutions basically became an important breeding ground eventually for Third World nationalism. Out of a certain unease with the literature on the history of nationalism in the countries of the global south. Most scholars, actually me included, are not especially sympathetic to nationalism, but this has made it more difficult for them to understand and tease out the substantive reasons for which so many people found the idea of the nation state so attractive. And this problem, in my view, is even more acute for the countries of what used to be called the Third World, which most scholars, for example Benedict Anderson, have treated, when it came to nationalism, as an instance of the transfer of ideas from Europe. Now, this is not entirely wrong, of course, to treat Third World nationalism as an instance of the transfer of ideas from Europe, but it has tended to reduce the subject, in my view, essentially to a matter of what Ho Chi Minh read during his stay in Paris. And this might be interesting, but I believe we need to turn away from this overly idealist understanding of the global spread of nationalism. I make two main arguments. The first one is that the process of migration itself kindled a nationalizing dynamic, in that it generated ethnic leaders who claimed certain rights for their respective groups. And those leaders eventually fashioned what in the book I call a shadow diplomacy, which in a way foretold the post-war United Nations. And the second argument has to do with cross-group exchange, which was much more intense in a place as diverse as Paris than it was elsewhere. And the inherent unevenness, that is the argument here, of this setting spurred mutual learning curves between groups. Here, French communism and the Communist International in Moscow played an important part in that they furnished common platforms on which the representatives of what they called oppressed nations interacted. But they also pushed these representatives to synchronize their claims towards a convergence on the nation-state model. And through the combination of those two arguments, I tried to make a case for the importance of the social history of a particular place, in this case interwar Paris, and how this mattered more broadly in the global history of nationalism in the 20th century.